This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and it's Monday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're going to take a look at Magic's newest Evergreen keyword ability, Ward. An Evergreen keyword is one that we see on several cards in every single set. In the case of the Ward keyword, it makes your opponent pay a cost of some kind when they target your permanent, and if they don't, that spell or ability gets countered. While there were some earlier cards that featured similar effects, like Reality Smasher, which is different in that it doesn't count abilities, the mechanic made its debut as a standardized effect and keyword in 2021's Strixhaven, and it quickly became Evergreen. I think this is one of the best mechanics they've introduced in the recent past. It's a much better mechanic than Hexproof, which simply prevents the opponent from targeting a permanent at all. That's way too powerful, and it feels awful to play against. Meanwhile, cards with Ward are harder to deal with, but usually not impossible to deal with. Ward can be modulated a ton too, and still offers some pretty ridiculous protection if you want to make the Ward cost incredibly high, and at the same time it can also be used just to make sure a creature is harder to deal with efficiently. Basically, I like the range that Ward allows for. While Hexproof is still around, Ward has definitely stepped in as the much more regularly used mechanic, and it fills a similar design space. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have Ward or grant Ward to something. In all, 86 cards qualified for the list, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, it is Svelune of Sea and Sky. This 3-mana 3/4 is an amazing merfolk payoff. She's indestructible if you have at least 2 other merfolk in play. When she attacks, you get to draw a card, and importantly for this list, she gives all of your other merfolk Ward 1. While Ward 1 is certainly a minimal cost, slowing down opposing removal by a whole turn is a pretty big deal. This can be especially true when she's protecting merfolk who are granting her indestructibility. Your merfolk can do significantly more damage when they gain another turn as a result of increasing the cost of removal. She was printed in Modern Horizons 2, which means the only 60 card formats where she is legal are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, but all 3 of those formats feature merfolk decks, and so far she's gained points in both Modern and Legacy, and it looks like that's going to continue. At number 9, it is Imrith, Desert Doom. When this 6-mana 5/5 flyer deals combat damage to your opponent, you draw a card. And if you have fewer than 3 cards in your hand, you get to draw cards equal to the difference. In other words, you get to draw 3 if you have 0 cards in your hand. It also has Ward 4 while it's untapped, and that generally means that you can get in with this at least once before your opponent can kill it, since Ward 4 is a big enough tax that it makes pretty much every removal spell expensive. While in Standard, it was played as a win condition in some control decks, and it also has a point from a Pioneer Sultai control deck. It doesn't have any points since 2022 though, and it may be done gaining points altogether. At number 8, it is Phyrexian Fleshgorger. This creature has Prototype, so you can cast it either as a 7-mana 7/5 with Menace and Lifelink, or you can pay 1 colorless and 2 black for a 3/3 with the same keywords. It also comes with Ward, of course, and in this case, your opponent has to pay life equal to the Gorger's power. Making your opponent pay life to kill something is really good for aggressive decks, because this will do damage to your opponent basically no matter what. These different forms of Ward also make it flavorful to give it to creatures of any color, something that's much harder to do with Hexproof. Red and black Hexproof cards usually involve paying life or some other type of cost than mana. Anyway, because the Fleshgorger has Menace and Lifelink, if they don't deal with it quickly, they're going to end up super far behind, and if they deal with it, they have to suffer at least a little bit. In other words, this puts your opponent in a horrible spot, and that's something you should always be interested in doing. And if you end up paying the full 7 mana late, the Gorger is basically unkillable. The Gorger has already been played in black aggro decks in Standard, Modern, Pioneer, and Legacy, and it has a great shot at continuing to move up the list. At number 7, it is Colossal Sky Turtle. This turtle can do a whole bunch of stuff. You can cast it as a 7 mana 6/5 with flying and ward 2, but you can also channel it. If you pay 2 generic and a green, you can return a card from your graveyard to your hand, and if you pay 1 generic and a blue, it can bounce a creature. The modality here is awesome, and it's pretty nice it has ward 2 when it is a creature, since it isn't the most efficient creature ever. This thing was a limited all-star, and it sees play in Modern Living Index, which are all about getting creatures in the graveyard ahead of casting the powerful sorcery, which gets rid of all creatures in play and puts all creatures from the graveyard on the battlefield. The Sky Turtle works great there because it comes with a built-in way to discard that also gives you some extra value. Once it comes back, it can end the game in a hurry, and Ward 2 means your opponent is going to have to pay a significant amount of mana if they want to take it down. As long as Living Index are a thing in Modern, the turtle is going to keep gaining points. At number 6, it is Tolarian Terror, which gives us back-to-back cards that were amazing and limited, and made the jump to 60-card formats. Tolarian Terror is a 7 mana 5/5 with Ward 2, but it reduces its cost by 1 generic for every spell in your graveyard. If you have a lot of cheap instants and sorceries in your deck, it isn't too difficult to get this to the point where it's incredibly cheap to cast, and once it's on the table, it can hit really hard, and Ward makes it a pain to deal with. In Standard, it's been played in spell-heavy blue tempo decks, and in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal, it has lent its name to an entire archetype. Dimir Terror decks look to quickly load the graveyard and add huge Tolarian Terrors and Gurmag Anglers to the board. The Terror still has a lot of time left in Standard, and it's likely to keep gaining points in Pauper too. At number 5, it is Sedgemoor Witch, which comes from Strixhaven, the very first set to feature Ward. The Witch gives you a ton for only 3 mana. It's a 3/2 with Menace that cranks out a Pest token every time you cast an instant or sorcery, and it comes with Ward, which makes your opponent pay 3 life. Generating a 1/1 token every time you cast a spell has proven to be a very powerful ability, as illustrated by cards like Young Pyromancer and Monastery Mentor. The Witch was only moderately successful in Standard, seeing play in a variety of black control decks, but like the Pyromancer and Mentor, the Witch has been quite successful in the Eternal formats. In Legacy, it's gained points in Arclight, Phoenix, and Delver of Secrets decks, and in Vintage, the format where it's done the most, its presence has even led to the birth of a Dimir Witch deck that gets its name from the Sedgemoor Witch herself. The Witch is in a great spot to keep gaining points going forward. At number 4, it is Patchwork Automaton. This 2 mana 1/1 artifact creature comes with Ward 2, and it gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you cast an artifact spell. This can allow the automaton to grow rapidly, and it's very hard to deal with in the early stages when it's small because of Ward. While it hasn't done much in Standard, it has already done a ton of work in formats with larger card pools and more powerful artifact decks, like Pioneer Modern and Vintage. In Modern, it's played in Hardened Scales decks, which are all about artifacts that involve +1/+1 counters, and the automaton gets really absurd with Scales in play. It's in a great spot to keep gaining points in multiple formats going forward, and it's pretty likely to move up this list in the future. At number 3, it is Rafine Scheming Seer, a 3 mana 1/4 with flying and Ward 1. She's the leader of the Obscura in New Capenna, so it should come as no surprise that she has an incredibly powerful version of that faction's keyword, Connive. Connive lets you draw a card and discard a card, and if you discard a non-land, the creature that connived gets a +1/+1 counter. Rafine's particular connive trigger is when you attack, and when you do, you connive X times, where X is the number of attacking creatures you have, and you connive with one of your attacking creatures. This can let you dig much deeper in your deck while also growing one of your creatures in play. Giving her Ward 1 makes it just a little bit harder to deal with her, which is certainly frustrating because her presence on the board is pretty amazing for whoever controls her. She's been fairly dominant in Standard, with the so-called Esper Rafine decks finding tons of success. These tend to be Esper mid-range decks, and Rafine is the centerpiece of the deck. In Pioneer, she sees play in Greasefang decks, which try to discard Parhelion and bring it back with Greasefang, and Rafine can get the powerful vehicle in the graveyard while also being a potential Plan B win condition. She still has a lot of time in Standard left, and the fact that she has already found success elsewhere means she's in a great spot to keep gaining points. At number 2, it is Graveyard Trespasser. She's a werewolf from Innistrad Midnight Hunt, and that means she's a different card depending on the day-night cycle. Both sides have Ward that forces your opponent to discard a card. This is pretty powerful as it forces your opponent to 2-for-1 themselves to deal with her, and they kind of have to because she's really strong. During the day, you get a 3-mana 3/3 that exiles a card from a graveyard when it enters and attacks, and drains 1 life if the card you exile is a creature. If it's night, it grows to 4/4 and starts exiling 2 cards at a time. This gives you a ton of value between reasonable stats, graveyard hate, and life gain. This assortment of abilities has made it something of a Swiss Army knife. It's a pretty attractive card for lots of black decks in Standard and Pioneer, whether they're aggro, mid-range, or control decks. It's going to keep on gaining points in those formats, but the number 1 card has a massive lead, so I don't think it's ever going to catch it. And that card is Hall of Storm Giants. The Hall is a land that enters tapped if you control 2 or more other lands. It can tap for blue mana, and you can pay 5 generic and a blue to turn it into a 7/7 giant with Ward 3 until end of turn. This card already has such an enormous score because it was a staple when it was in Standard. If you were playing blue, your deck probably had one of these. It's also played heavily in Pioneer and Modern. This is because creature lands are just great. This can produce mana for you early, like any other land, and this one even comes into play untapped in the early game, and then in the late game it can become a pretty real win condition, as slamming in for 7 every turn adds up quickly. The Hall having Ward 3 is no small thing either. Creature lands are also pretty much immune to sorcery speed removal, so having Ward 3 narrows the number of removal spells that can deal with the Hall even more, as it forces your opponent to leave up a significant amount of mana if they're going to kill it once you turn it into a creature, which really softens the blow of them destroying it in the first place. Hall of the Storm Giants is very unlikely to ever relinquish its number 1 spot on this list because it can be played effectively in virtually any blue deck. So, those are the 10 cards with Ward that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to make it harder for your opponent to target your permanents, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for every card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at keywords and mechanics, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a patron or a channel member. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.